So, hi, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me on your podcast. I'm really excited to come on board and to share with you.
Hello and welcome to Obehi Podcast. I'm your host, Obehi Ewanfo, and I strongly believe that everyone has a story to share. Now let's get started into this episode.
A little bit about who I am and what I do. So, my name is Kesha Clinkscale, and I am originally from New Orleans, Louisiana, in the United States. I have a pretty substantial background in nonprofit and NGO management and engagement. And I'm just happy to be here to talk a little bit about what I do and what I'm passionate about.
Thank you so much for that, Kesha. Now, you were born in Louisiana, is that correct?
That's correct.
All right. Can you tell me a bit about your early childhood? We want to know more about your story. Help me understand that.
Sure. So, yeah, I was born in New Orleans, Louisiana, which is one of the greatest cities on earth, as far as I'm concerned. My parents are originally also from New Orleans. I have a younger brother who is doing incredibly amazing things in the venture capital space. But we grew up pretty normal, lower middle class family. Attended private school up until high school. And then I went to my undergrad. I actually stayed in New Orleans. Um, I attended Tulane University, studied African studies and sports medicine. And so, yeah, I mean, so my childhood was pretty good. Enjoyed uh, growing up in New Orleans. It's a pretty amazing city with um, some of the most authentic cultural experiences you could possibly imagine. But yeah,
Mm-hmm,
pretty good
mm-hmm.
childhood.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I understand that nearly there is there is a huge African American community there. Is that correct? Can you say something about that?
Yeah, so the African American community in New Orleans is incredibly diverse, incredibly rich, so much authenticity and so much culture that's also blended with other cultures throughout the diaspora, including Native American Indians as well as French. There's a huge French influence on New Orleans. One of the most amazing subcultures is actually the Mardi Gras Indians. This is a really incredible story in which the Native Americans, way back during these times of slavery, actually provided a lot of support, guidance, and help to African slaves and ultimately African Americans as they fought against the slavery system. And in tribute, as an honor and recognition for the support of the Native American community that lived there, the African American community began to do what's called masking, in that they created these incredibly elaborate costumes that were very much so similar to the featherings that the Native Americans wore. And so this sort of honoring and paying homage to the Native Americans has evolved over the past couple hundred years. And that, what is the word? That tradition continues to this very day, in which we have communities within the African American community that represents various tribes of Indian tribes who helped African slaves either escape and or rebel against the slavery system. So that's one of the most unique things about New Orleans as it relates to the African American community.
That's very interesting. Now, how do you pass on those knowledge to the younger generation so that it is not
Mm,
forgotten? Because in the diaspora
yes,
community, it is important that we continue to tell our stories. So
yes,
we continuously reenact it so we know where we are coming from and what has been the passes. Let me understand
yeah.
that.
I am so glad that you asked that question because back when the tradition first started, the way in which it was conveyed to the younger generations was completely oral. Stories were told, children were involved in the creation of the costumes, which I'd like to pause right here for a moment just to explain to you how elaborate that process is. So these costumes can weigh anywhere from 100 to 200 pounds, including the head garbs and sort of the shields that are made. They're made completely from hand, by hand, with feathers and beads. And the patterns of these costumes are just extraordinary. And so the way in which the tradition is passed down from generation, one, it was orally, right? So the families of the various tribes would share with the children what they were doing. And oftentimes the children would be a part of the costume making process. But then the other part is actually hands on, and that's the beading of these costumes. The costumes typically take anywhere from 9 months to a year to actually make. And once they're worn, if they're not sort of preserved in some sort of museum of some sort, they used to actually undo the costumes and use feathers and the beads for the next year, but they would make a completely different suit. So yeah, so that's how it was passed down. And of course, as technology became more integrated into society, these traditions were then recorded at some point, on in books as well as on video, and now it's just a prolific sort of um, um, way that the information is conveyed all over social media now. But yeah, it was completely oral, with hands-on experience is how it was originally sort of conveyed from one generation to the next.
All right. Now, another thing I'm sort of curious about trying to understand is that the Louisiana of your time when you were still a young girl, and
Mhm.
today you are a full-grown adult. You have had a lot of experiences. What kind of changes do you see? What kind of
Mm.
reminiscence do you have of the past in relation to where we are today, 2022?
Yeah, so the most amazing thing about New Orleans is that the culture is in fact rich, and it continues. Um, the issue, though, occurred, or one of the issues that occurred, is when Hurricane Katrina happened several years ago. And what ended up happening, the hurricane displaced many thousands of individuals. And as you can imagine, people who have limited resources or access to resources, um, those folks who don't, were impacted the most. And of course, those tend to be communities of color, right? So no matter what we're talking about, whether it's healthcare or natural disasters, any type of disastrous issue that impacts a community of color, it is exacerbated more so because of the communities of color. And it's unfortunate, but in growing up in New Orleans, um, what I see now is that there are people who are still trying to regain their footing from a hurricane that happened, so long ago. And so I think that that's one of the concerns and the things that's sort of heartbreaking as it relates to um, disasters, right? Because when they happen, they severely impact communities with greatest needs, and those communities typically are communities of color.
I think George Bush was the president at the time that Hurricane Katrina happened. There were a lot of
Yeah.
news about it at the time. I know sometimes all this thing can easily be politicized and
Yeah.
all of that. So you mean today, how many years ago now, people are still suffering from the effect of that hurricane? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, so anytime you have a disaster like that happens, if you have means and if you have resources, your recovery is going to be quicker. It's going to be more efficient. Will you be sort of dis discombobulated a little bit? Yeah, but But if you have resources and access to resources, then that time is limited. For people who do not have access to resources, that time frame is extended um, far beyond those who do. So, even though a hurricane was, such a long time ago, you still have people that are still trying to rebound, and parts of the community, that still trying to rebound. And what I was going to say was, as it relates to the Mardi Gras Indian um, culture and traditions, so many of those costumes that were made and the materials that were used to make them were destroyed in the storm. And so, if you have folks that are trying to, or who were heavily invested in that community before the storm, um, it, after the storm, it's like their first priority, of course, were the basic needs: food, clothing, shelter, transportation, economic stability, and trying to get back on their feet. The priority, even though it's critically important, may not have been to, resurrect or re-engage with that cultural tradition. And so even though the tradition is back and it's vibrant and people and communities are still engaging with it, it wasn't, or it's not to the extent that it was before the storm, if that makes sense.
Sorry that I'm going to be asking you a few things related to the hurricane. Um, yes, because this is story. This is something that have happened. We are not like trying to invent something here, because it affects the community and it still people still continue to suffer from it several years later. It is important for me to ask you a few things, maybe personally. So, at
Okay.
the time of the hurricane, where were you? When did you first realize that something was happening?
So believe it or not, I moved away from New Orleans in 1999. And I've been living in Atlanta. So I moved away in 99. I lived in South Africa for about a year. And when I returned from the continent, I moved to Atlanta. And so I've been here for over 20 or 22, or just about 22 years. And so when Hurricane Katrina happened, I was actually working for the American Red Cross, which part of the work that they do is disaster relief. And so, interestingly enough, I'll never forget that day, the day after the storm. Had went into work, and there were just hundreds and hundreds of people, my people from New Orleans, standing outside of the Red Cross seeking help. They had evacuated from New Orleans, and many of them did not have um, family in Atlanta, and they just needed shelter. And so, working for an organization that provides international disaster relief, like the Red Cross, it hit closer to home to me than I than I ever would have expected. Right? It was like, okay, so not only do you work for one of the world's largest disaster relief agencies, but like your family, um, extended, and people who I don't know but are just fellow New Orleanians were standing at our front door at the Red Cross seeking help. So it was doubly important for me to be present, and to do everything that I could to make sure that people got what they need.
Mhm. All right. Did people really got what they need? What was the response? I want you to speak to me about that briefly.
Mm. So, what the Red Cross does, it's a phenomenal organization. It's typically the first agency or nonprofit organization that shows up on the scene of a disaster. And so, there are immediate needs that are addressed. So, shelter, first and foremost, clothing, um, food, and then that's what's sort of addressed immediately. And then there's an assessment of what is further needed beyond sort of the first few days after a disaster. Oftentimes it's more extended stay if individuals' homes have been severely impacted by a disaster. Sometimes it's transportation, sometimes it's food, sometimes it's a connection to governmental resources that can help with the long-term recovery. And so that's sort of the type of support that the Red Cross provided. It did so after Katrina in a monumental way, but a lot of the issues that we experienced was because we didn't understand at the time just how massive the response needs were going to be. So, there were just so many lessons learned in the days following Katrina that the needs were far greater than what the organization had the capacity to address at that moment. It took a little bit of time to sort of ramp up those resources and then put in place a mechanism to distribute those resources equitably.
Thank you so much for those sharing about Hurricane Katrina and the community, the African diaspora community, in this case, the African American community in Louisiana and in other parts of the US. And now let's come back to you again. How do you describe the kind of work that you do, your passion
Yeah,
and your work? Let's spend some time there.
sure. So let me start with after I graduated from college, many of my friends, they knew exactly what they wanted to do with their lives. Many of them went on to medical school and law school and business school. Some of them went to physical therapy school, but I had no idea what I wanted. All I knew was that I had gotten this degree in African studies and I had also studied sports medicine. And so I decided to sort of merge those two topics and integrate women in development into that. And so I said, okay, I am going to write a proposal um, talking about women in development, asking someone to fund me to go and do research on South African women athletes and how they were continuing to be marginalized since the fall of apartheid. And so I sent this proposal. Actually, it was like a one-page letter to 100 companies in the U.S. Some of them were multinational, but they were all based had a presence in the U.S. And I asked them to go to fund me to go and do this really important study. And so I heard back from about 4 of those companies. Uh, 2 of them basically said that they didn't do that type of work. One of them said that they didn't do that type of funding, but good luck. And one of them said, we don't do this type of funding, but there's a university in Atlanta that might be interested in your work. And that university was Clark Atlanta University in Atlanta. And so I sent Clark Atlanta a letter similar to the one that I sent to these 100 companies. And so Clark was like, yeah, you know what? I think that we might be interested in learning more about this. And so what they ended up doing was funding me to go to South Africa to conduct this research on South African women athletes. While I was there, I also had an opportunity to work for a small NGO called Border Institute of Primary Healthcare. The organization was based in a little town called Quigney, East London. And the work that they did was HIV/AIDS awareness and prevention. Doing that work ignited something in me that sort of directed my path professionally. At that time, I had determined that I wanted to spend the rest of my life professionally working in the space to improve the lives of others. And so when I got back to the States, that's the course that I set out to do, I set out on. And so I began my career in nonprofit management and NGO engagement. So I work for some of the largest nonprofits on the globe. As I mentioned, American Red Cross, I spent time there. Spent time also with the American Cancer Society. I work for Boys and Girls Clubs of America. And then I've also spent time working with small family foundations. And so in all of that work, it all sort of points to this passion of mine to help make people's lives better. Even if I never get to meet these people ever as long as I live. I want to make sure that people have access to resources, that people are able to improve their qualities of life, that they are able to do so with dignity, with hope, and with enthusiasm. And yeah, and so that sort of has been my journey.
Now, your decision to go to South Africa to study the women, the situation of the women there, does it have to do with your study of to your African study, which is where you major in the university?
Absolutely. I spent 4 years at Tulane University, completely immersed in the academia side of the diaspora. And as a woman, there have always been challenges for us. We've always had to address, disparities in regards to our voice and our importance and our relevance in any and every space. But in the diaspora and across the diaspora, that was even was even more significant. And so, yeah, so my studies absolutely led me to this intent desire to address and to, raise awareness about the um, marginalization of women, particularly in sports, as well as, beyond the system of apartheid.
Well, the question of apartheid, maybe we might not really need to open that argument today because, yeah, you have both legs and hands and all of it. Because this is a system that existed when the world was already civilized, if we want to put it like that, no? In that we see a very few minority of people who come and they imprison the entire population. They were armed, they have every resources to be able to do that. And we have this big giant country like the United States and not doing anything about it because they didn't see to feel concerned about it, no?
Yeah,
So a lot of things happened there during the time. So it appeared as if the violence, the oppression was actually sanctioned by Western government because they could have done something
right,
if they wanted to, but they choose not to. They joined the part of the oppression and the people just
right,
suffered. They died. A lot of people died. And that was really
absolutely,
very horrible a situation in Africa that could have been
absolutely,
avoided by the bigger power, but they choose not to. That is not a good
absolutely.
thing. Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing about that, and we see those types of choices being made even today, right? And it all goes back to what is the value proposition of the people involved? What are the value propositions for those who could actually make change? And if that value proposition does not rise to the need of what these larger first world countries believe are valuable, then they won't engage. They won't step in. They won't um, try to alleviate the pain and suffering of people from around the globe because there isn't a direct um, interest, right? But then you have agencies like the UN Foundation who try to raise awareness about these issues and try to, make larger countries and first world countries sort of understand what the needs are and how everything is really all interconnected. Sometimes those issues receive attention and resources, and a lot of times, unfortunately, they don't.
A lot of people died. A lot of people died. A lot of people were mutilated, massacred. What really was needed for the United Nations to take action? What really was needed for bigger player like the United States to take action to say we stand for justice? Anyway, again, justice. Like I often said in this podcast, we can never expect the West to give justice in terms of Africa. It's not going to happen like Dr. Benwick said, they will give you just this. So we're not going to get justice from there. So that okay, and that is what it is. All right, that is fine. We're not going to make some blame today. That is okay. Now, you did African studies. You have never been to Africa. You have been in US. In your preparation to go to Africa, what was your impression? What was your understanding? What did you think you were going to find in Africa?
So what I knew was that South Africa was a incredibly developed nation, right? Uh, Perception wise in the United States, people have to understand that images of the continent were always presented in a particular way, as if the continent, number one, was one country, two, that there was no industrialization, and three, that the people who lived on the continent were not as technologically savvy or academically savvy. And I knew that all of those stereotypes were wrong, right? And when I got to South Africa, it was confirmed, right? So there are parts of the country that are rural, right? But that rings true for the United States. There are parts of the country that are incredibly industrialized, right? And when I stepped foot in Johannesburg, I felt like I was in New York City. When I visited Cape Town, I felt like I was in San Francisco. When I spent time in Durban, I felt like I was in Atlanta. When I spent time, I lived actually in Quigney, East London, and that town reminded me of Alabama during the height of the civil rights movement. And so there were all of these similarities that endeared me to South Africa, right? That reminded me of home. And then there were experiences that I felt and that I witnessed that reminded me of what it must have been like growing up during the Jim Crow era in the United States, right? When we're talking about the levels of racial injustices, the amount of discrimination and segregation that was almost parallel, if not exactly parallel, to what it was like being in the South during the Jim Crow era and the eras of segregation. That's what it was like when I was there in South Africa in 1998, 1999. So it was jarring to feel what it must have felt like for my parents and my grandparents and my great grandparents as they struggled and fought against segregation. Because the people of South Africa were doing the exact same thing, but it was in 1998, not 1964. And then it was in in another part of the world. And so I often wrote back home, emailed and letters to my family, particularly my mom and my grandmother, telling them that I now know what they must have felt, when they were told that they couldn't drink from a particular water fountain or they couldn't go into a particular store because I was experiencing those exact same things until people found out or learned or heard my accent and realized that I was from America. Once that happened, it was a complete 180 shift in engagement, right? It was like, okay, so you're not African, you are American, and we believe that you could help us. So it was really interesting.
It was really interesting. That's cool. That's cool. Right. All right. Now you went there with a research, right? To study something. Tell me something more about those research. What did you find? How did you approach the people? What were you looking for in terms of um evidence? Evidence of
Yeah.
what were you looking for?
So what I was looking for was to find out if things were better, different, or worse for women who were interested in pursuing sports, um, whether it was on the collegiate or professional level. And so I spent a lot of time at the University of KwaZulu Natal in their sports department, talking to women students who were also athletes. And what we found again, or what I found, was the similarities and how, men's sports were the dominant sports. Those were the sports that received the most um, financial support, the most media coverage, the most excitement. And women's sports, while they did exist, they didn't receive half as much of the attention or the finances or the resources to promote that. And so, even though it wasn't, um, uh, I wasn't in the United States, it was it was a parallel, right? Speaking to a lot of women athletes who were just as capable and talented and strong and skilled, as their male counterpart athletes. They just were not receiving the same amount of attention.
All right, now looking at the diaspora community again, because that is where you are part of. No, you are in Louisiana. You are an American, yes, but you are an different kind of American. No, in that we look at ourselves as a group of people, no, that have a sort of we have a common destiny, if we want to put it like that. It doesn't matter wherever you might find yourself on the face of the earth, as long as we are the sons and daughters of Africa, we look ourselves from this light. Now,
Mm-hmm.
looking at community service, how important is it today? Because before you were talking of the situation in Louisiana, that many years after the Hurricane Katrina, people still feel the impact.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that is calling on a certain responsibility on the part of both the government and the people that are living there. So I'm looking at the role of some individual to participate, whether in the
Mm-hmm.
name of NGO, organizing ourselves, being able to look at how we can maybe attempt to address the things, the problem that affect us. So that's why I'm
Mm-hmm.
asking you where you see the role of community service within the
Yeah.
African diaspora community. Help me.
Yeah. So community service is not a monolithic thing. Community service has to be a comprehensive group of not just individuals, not just neighborhoods, not just NGOs or nonprofits, not just the government, not just private sector or for profit companies. It literally has to be a comprehensive, collaborative strategy in which people sort of buy into a common denominator. And whatever that common denominator is, applying all of everyone's sort of subject matter expertise as well as resources to address those issues, right? And so you find many success stories around the world in which those types of collaborations actually have worked and have improved communities. You know, but there's no shortage of communities that need to be improved. So it almost seems like very little work is getting done. But as long as there's sort of this idea that this collective group sort of can embrace, change will happen, even though it may seem microscopic, even though it may seem disjointed, it can happen. But it has to be sort of this really comprehensive collaboration of individuals who have a diverse set of skills and subject matter expertise and resources to address the issues.
Yeah, right. Thank you so much for that, Kesha. Now, I believe so much in what you're saying that a collaborative, comprehensive approach to addressing the problem can actually find a solution to it. Because in
Mhm.
the diaspora, we are a force that can be reckoned with. We are more than 500 million people, if I'm not mistaken, maybe more, maybe less. So if we were to organize ourselves, there is no army anywhere in the world that can stand us if we were
Agreed.
to organize ourselves. But if we don't
Agreed.
organize ourselves, even the least country in the world can do anything to that more than 500 million people. So it's a
Yeah.
question of this comprehensive, collaborative organization.
Yeah.
Now, in 2013, that was when I started the research that led to our training platform, that is Aclasses Training Academy, Content Academy, and this podcast. The idea was to find out about the presence of Africans in northern Italy, because I just come to Italy then. I spent a few years. I was asking myself, but who are the first people that came here? What did they do? What can I learn from them? Because the story is very important now, in that if you don't tell your story, you risk leaving that chance to somebody else to tell it for you. And you are going to have to pray that that person must have your interests at heart. Otherwise, that is a huge risk to you. All right. So what I found is that within the community, whether you are looking at Italy or in some other parts of the world, the US or UK, or in Canada, where you have a huge African diaspora community, the problem is the same. So the approach is going to be more or less about the same. Either we need this collaborative, comprehensive approach to address the problem. It's not that the people really are missing. It's not like there is no education at all. It's not that there are people, the people do not know anything at all. But what I am saying, I'm suggesting is that why don't we collaborate more? Why don't we put in a lot of knowledge that we already have at the service of the community? I'm not saying for free. That is not what I mean. But that our community should be the centerpiece of our agenda. That we should plan to own the businesses in the community, train the people so that they can control the community. How do we go about this? So that when something happens, of course, we will always ask for the help of the general government. You are in UK, ask for the help of the UK government, for example. You are in US, ask for the help of the federal government. But beside that, the community can have something of their own to sort of intervene. That is where I'm going. How could we do that?
So I'm going to answer this question with a statement, right? And that statement is, united we stand, divided we fall, right? United we stand, divided we fall. And when you have a community that is united, meaning that there is a common denominator that we all have embraced, a set of core values that we all believe in, sort of a strategy that we have all decided to work towards, we're united, right? And you can actually affect change. But when you have competing priorities, particularly in communities where resources are limited, there is no interest, or I shouldn't say that there's no interest there. The interest is buried underneath what the immediate most pressing needs are. So if your immediate most pressing needs are as a family to shelter your family, to feed your family, to clothe your family, community organizing might be a priority, but it's not your top priority, right? Your top priority is meeting your very basic needs. And that sort of is aligned with the Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? And so as an individual, you want to address those first. But if you have a community that has sort of a diverse group of individuals who don't have the sort of same needs, you're not going to create sort of a unified approach to addressing what the real issues are. It's going to be fragmented. And that's what you see around the world. You see fragmentations of work that is being done to address the needs of some, but not the needs of all, right? And so as long as there is this sort of inequality in terms of access to resources, we're going to struggle with this. It's not like we can't address it, because it is being addressed. It's just being addressed in sort of a fragmented way.
All right. Now, let's say we are looking for a solution. And now we know finally that our fragmented approach cannot save us, no? That if we are only looking for our little pockets of interest, that is what is going to always remain, pockets of interest. Pocket of interest cannot save a people. To save a people, we need massive approach geared towards a collective objective. like Marcus Garvey will do, for example. Look at that was
Yes,
an
yes,
individual, that was a man,
yes,
galvanized the entire population together, build a shipping
yes,
line. Do you know
yes,
what that mean at the time? How many
right.
shipping lines today are owned by Africans or African diaspora? How many?
I don't think that there's one, is there?
So this is what we are talking about. How do
Yeah,
we, what do we need to be able to understand that our only salvation is to have a common interest where everybody is rallying around? We can't
yeah,
say that we don't have any reason for that. Look at
yeah,
Israel, for example, a small
yes,
country in the Middle East building nuclear weapon. And
yes,
guess what is their justification? That their people suffer in the hand of Nazi Germany. They don't want it
yes.
to ever happen again. Six
That's right.
million people, that was a lot. But
Yes,
we have tens and twenties and even not hundreds of millions of Africans that have been massacred. Is that not
yeah,
enough to say it should never happen again? Let's do everything we can to save ourselves.
yes.
Do we have a reason to do this?
Yes, we do. I think ideally, um, there are things that we can rally around. But again, because of the fragmentation of what those needs are, it's going to be difficult, not impossible, but difficult. The other thing about it is that, you know, there is sort of the identifying of what the needs are for the diaspora, and then the acknowledgement of those needs from allies, right? So, because we can't do it alone, right? Um, we can't do it alone. When you give the example of Israel, you have the majority of the world supporting Israel, right? Majority of the world supporting Israel. That is not the case for the diaspora, right? And so that's sort of what I'm thinking. There has to be a unified agenda, but then there also has to be the engagement with allies. And with that engagement with allies, they have to understand that the addressing sort of the issues for the diaspora is not only morally right, but it can actually benefit all. Right? So,
Absolutely, absolutely. Because look at, okay, that it will benefit all, it is true. Look,
mhm,
for example, how many computer gadgets that are sold in Africa.
yes,
That is a market opportunity, for example. If you just keep
yeah,
the people poor, they cannot afford to pay anything. That is a
that's
loss
right.
to you that is a producer. So
That's right.
this globalized economy, we must make an effort, of course, talking at the international level now, we must make an
Right,
effort to make sure that people can afford the
right.
tools of the age.
That's right.
If they
Yeah,
only live on mere $1, they cannot afford it. So you are losing, I am losing. Now, coming
that's
back
right.
to the African diaspora again, I don't
Mm,
know if it's just because we don't have enough ally. I know we do need ally and we do need people to support us. But do we really have we really done enough? And so that what is lacking is the ally? Because I don't think a lot of people actually like Marcus Garvey at this time. There were some people
no,
who didn't like him. I'm talking of people outside, even people within Africa. Sometimes they didn't like him very much. Of course, everybody is a subject to their education that they receive, no?
mm,
So of course, within the limit, he did that, meaning that if we have enough belief, enough reorientation of our mind, we can
yeah,
do a lot. So
right. But
I think, yes,
it,
please.
it's interesting because not only are you talking about people who um, from an academic standpoint, because Marcus Garvey, but in addition to all of the other great things, he was an incredible academician. So you've got individuals who are also human, right? And with the human experience come human emotions, many of which include pride, and not wanting to sort of align with someone who isn't necessarily from where they are from, right? So that creates this, you know, division, if you will, and not being able to galvanize people around one cause. It's like, um, not everybody wants to follow, someone who is American but of African descent, right? Because there's distrust with the, with America, right? So, it's a really, it's simple, but it's also super complex, right? The simplicity of it is that when we help one, we help all, right? That's the simplicity of it. But the complexity of it is that people don't necessarily have trust for individuals who they have seen, or nations who they have seen harm and hurt others, right? So
Right. All right. I get that. We're going to look for a way to build the trust because that is the only way we are going to survive. I
yeah.
was reading this book by the Israeli writer, The 21 Lesson of the 21st Century. That is a very
Okay.
interesting book where the writer was saying that uh, uh, what actually differentiates the human being from the rest of the other animal, comparing human being to the apes, is our ability to tell story, to negotiate. Look at currency, for
Yes.
example. Why
Hmm.
would people organize themselves and go to Africa and dig up a hole on the ground and then give people some worthless paper they call dollars? Who said how many dollar can you put inside that hole to replenish it? Actually,
Right.
it doesn't make any sense in a logical sense of it. But we have a way of putting value in those paper so that that paper is now
Yes.
worth more than the hole that we dig on the land in the Niger Delta, polluting it, killing people, and all of that. So
Yeah.
I believe we need to master our story. We need to be the champion
Oh,
of it instead of
yes.
letting other do that for us. And if we manage to do that, we'll be able to go far. Anyway, so the
Yeah.
question actually I want to ask you is, what do you think it can be the right approach to build the diaspora together as a united body so that we can
Mm.
fight for a common interest? I believe it doesn't solve only the problem of the diaspora, but it also solve the problem of where they are coming from, which is Mother Africa.
Yes. Wow, that is a heavy question. Um, and I do want to sort of touch on what you mentioned about the importance of your story. Because if you don't, or if we don't tell our story, to your point, someone will tell it for us, and they will tell it from their perspective. They will tell it in a way that sort of elevates them, and or it gives them sort of a the most or the greatest sort of presence in our story. And so I think that it is wildly important for us to share our stories. And I see that happening so much more, particularly with the development and the technologies of the internet. We're doing a better job of telling our stories. But in terms of unifying, I think that that actually requires a few things, right? It requires sort of a assessment of themes, right? So if you hear, in the United States, people of color talking about, their greatness, right? And then you hear people in the Caribbean talking about their greatness and hopes and aspirations. And it sounds a lot like the greatness and the hopes and aspirations of people of color in the United States. And it sounds a lot like the aspiration, hopes, and desires of the people of color in Europe and on the continent. And so then you start developing, or you start seeing these patterns and themes. And once you start seeing these patterns and themes, then those things become the common denominator that communities across the globe, or communities of color across the globe, can sort of embrace and galvanize around and then act upon. And then that acting upon, of course, will then generate and result in impact. So I know that that sort of seems a little bit abstract, but I think that that's how um, change can actually be um, made on a on a global perspective. But it has to start with the identification of commonalities and themes and patterns that we're all sort of trying to strive towards. And I think that the younger generations um, are starting to see that when you look at the kids who are involved in wanting to talk about climate change and sort of governmental brutalities and injustices. You see, younger generations sort of speaking to that, and I think that that's part of the work that we've been doing up until this very point, right? Trying to create awareness about the things that are important to us. So I think it's just going to be a continuous process and a continuous chasing of um, of a better life for not just me, but for all.
How can people connect with you? Those who might want to work with you and want to connect with you, because we're also here for the connection.
Yeah, so I am certainly on LinkedIn at KT Clinkscale, as well as on social media, Facebook and Instagram, same handle.
Now, what would be your final thought, very briefly, to conclude the conversation that we have had today? Maybe a message or anything you want to leave the people
Yeah.
with.
What I'd love to leave the people with is a spark of optimism. I think that there has been a tremendous amount of work that has been done to raise awareness about issues that are impacting the diaspora. And there's been a great deal of achievements and accomplishments that we ought to celebrate. And then going forward, there's so much work to do. And one of the things that I'm super excited about is, again, sort of the energy and the expectations and the demands of the next generation to make the world a better place. And so, if we can support them in their efforts while also continuing to advance our own work, things will get better. Won't be perfect, but things will certainly get better.
Thank you so much. I like the optimism. That is very important for me. Thank you so much. I
Thank
appreciate the
you.
time.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure. Appreciate you so much.
If you enjoy this podcast, make sure you subscribe so you never miss any of our future episodes. Rate and review Obehi Podcast and share with your friends who might need it. I remain Obehi Ewanfo. Thank you so much for listening and talk to you in the next episode.